Welcome to our deep dive. Today it's all about the American Revolutionary War. You've sent us some really interesting stuff, including parts of that Wikipedia article.
It's amazing what you can find out, even if you think you know something pretty well.
Right, like I always thought it was, brave colonists versus the mighty British Empire. Kind of a simple story, but it's way more complicated, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. People don't always realize just how big this war was. I mean, over 8 years.
Wow.
It wasn't just a few battles, it was all over North America and the Caribbean, even the Atlantic Ocean.
Seriously, I always thought it was just like here in America.
Nope. And it wasn't just Britain versus the colonies either. Don't forget France and Spain. They wanted to take Britain down a peg.
Oh, right. They helped the Americans, didn't they?
Yeah, they sent money, soldiers, ships. They were a big deal.
So it was like this global power struggle, not just some little rebellion.
Exactly. And don't forget about the Native Americans.
Oh, yeah, of course.
A lot of them sided with Britain, hoping to protect their land. Their part of the story is important, but doesn't always get told.
That's true. We often forget that wars affect so many people in ways we don't even think about. But before we get too far ahead, let's rewind a bit. How did things get so bad that they started shooting at each other? What were, like, the triggers?
Well, the trouble had been brewing for a while. A big turning point was the French and Indian War. It ended in 1763.
I vaguely remember that one from school.
Britain won, but it was costly. Not just money, but their relationship with the colonies got strained.
Right. It put them in a ton of debt, didn't it?
Exactly. So Parliament's looking at this empty treasury, and taxpayers back home are grumbling. They decide, hey, the colonies should help pay for their own defense.
That makes sense. But didn't that lead to all those taxes and acts like the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act?
Yeah, all of a sudden there were taxes on everything. Molasses, legal documents, you name it.
And that's where the whole no taxation without representation thing comes from.
Right. Exactly. The colonists were furious. They were being taxed by a parliament where they had no say. It wasn't just about the money, it was the principle, like, take the Molasses Act.
Oh, yeah. What was that all about?
Well, it was supposed to be about regulating trade, but really it was forcing the colonists to buy molasses, for rum, only from British suppliers, even if it was more expensive.
So basically, Britain was controlling the colony's economy to keep the profits for themselves.
You got it. It was all about mercantilism. The colonies were just a source of raw materials and a market for British goods. And of course, no representation in Parliament. Resentment was brewing.
Yeah, I can imagine. Economic grievances, political tensions. Sounds like a recipe for disaster. What were some of the specific events that really pushed things over the edge?
Well, there were a few key moments, like the Boston Massacre in 1770. British troops fired on a crowd of civilians, killed 5 of them.
That was a big deal, right?
Huge. It was a turning point.
Yeah.
Really solidified that anti-British sentiment, became a symbol of British tyranny. And then a few years later, you have the Boston Tea Party.
Yes, the Tea Party. That image is iconic.
It was a bold move. The colonists, dressed as Native Americans, boarded those British ships and dumped all that tea in the harbor. It was a protest against the Tea Act.
Right. They weren't messing around.
Yeah.
So the Boston Massacre, then the Tea Party, what was the final straw?
The battles of Lexington and Concord, April 1775. That's where the first shots were fired.
Wow. The point of no return.
Yeah.
From talking to actually fighting. But let's talk about the people involved. On one side, you had the colonists who wanted independence.
The Patriots?
Right, the
Yeah.
Patriots, and then those who stayed loyal to the crown.
Loyals.
So it wasn't just a war between countries, it was dividing communities and families.
Absolutely. It was a civil war as much as anything. Brother against brother, really tough choices. And those choices came with a cost.
Okay, so we've got global powers, a divided nation, and the shooting has started. But what about that really important document, the one where they say, we're done with Britain?
Ah, you mean the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, that's the one.
July 1776. It was more than just complaining about the king.
It was like, boom, we are a new nation.
Right. It laid out the philosophical groundwork. All men are created equal, unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Powerful stuff.
And those ideas, wow, they went way beyond America, inspiring other revolutions. But declaring independence is one thing, actually winning it, that's another.
Oh, yeah. The hard part was just starting.
So how do you take on the world's biggest empire when you're basically a ragtag bunch of rebels?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
We've got George Washington, kind of inexperienced but determined, versus the British, with their fancy uniforms and years of training. What were each side's strengths and weaknesses?
That's a really good question. And Knowing those is key to understanding how the Americans actually won. On paper, the British had all the advantages: professional army, experienced leaders, tons of resources. But they had problems too.
Like what? I imagine fighting a war across an ocean isn't easy.
You're telling me. Supplying troops across the Atlantic was a nightmare. Ships took months. Things changed on the ground before they even arrived. Plus, America is huge. Even if they took cities controlling the countryside, forget about it.
So all that land and space. Good for America, bad for Britain.
Exactly. The Americans knew the land. They could use the forests and rivers to their advantage. Guerrilla warfare, hit-and-run tactics.
So the Americans were scrappy and resourceful, home field advantage, a burning desire for freedom, and a willingness to think outside the box.
You got it. And those factors were going to be crucial.
Okay, this is getting good. I'm ready to hear about some battles and those turning points. What were the moments that really mattered, the ones that pushed the Americans towards victory?
Well, that's where we're headed. We've got stories of crazy strategies, unlikely heroes, and battles that changed everything.
Let's do it. What were the first battles like? Did Britain just roll over them, or were there signs that the Americans could actually put up a fight?
It was a mixed bag at first. Britain won a lot. They had the firepower and the experience. But the Americans showed they had some grit, and they could be clever.
I love an underdog story. Can you give us an example of how the Americans used their smarts to surprise the British?
Sure, the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 1775, right outside Boston. Technically, Britain won, but it was costly.
What happened?
The Americans were outnumbered and outgunned, but they held their ground on Breed's Hill. The British had to attack uphill 3 times before they finally took it.
So even in defeat, the Americans proved they were a tough nut to crack.
Oh, yeah. Bunker Hill showed the British this wouldn't be easy, and it gave the Americans a huge morale boost.
What a way to start. But what about France? They were big allies, right? When did they officially join the party?
They were secretly helping from the beginning with money and supplies, but they officially declared war in 1778, after the Americans won at Saratoga.
Saratoga, that was a big one.
Bro, yeah, huge. It was in upstate New York, 1777, a turning point. It showed the French the Americans could actually win this thing.
So a military victory and a diplomatic one.
Exactly. France joining the war changed everything. Troops, supplies, ships, the balance of power shifted.
Wow. It's amazing how one battle can change the whole course of history. But now I want to know about the actual fighting. How did the Americans, with fewer resources and less experience, hold their own against the mighty British?
They had to be creative, they had to fight a different kind of war. Forget those big battles in open fields. That was Britain's game. The Americans had to use guerrilla tactics, ambushes, raids.
So it was all about being sneaky and quick.
They knew they couldn't win every fight, but they could make it so expensive for Britain that eventually they'd have to quit.
I love it. The classic underdog story.
Ugh.
But tactics aside, they still needed supplies, right? They didn't have an empire backing them up.
Yeah, the Continental Army was always struggling to get what they needed. Money, weapons, ammo, even basic things like food and clothes.
Ugh, can you imagine? Trying to fight a war on an empty stomach with holes in your boots. How do they even survive?
It was tough. Their dedication was incredible. The Continental Congress tried their best, but they were broke. Local communities had to step up and donate what they could. Food, clothes, anything they could spare.
So the whole nation had to pitch in, on and off the battlefield.
Absolutely. It was a real test of their will and their unity.
So we've got global powers meddling, a divided nation, and a ragtag army facing a giant empire. It's amazing. But I'm really curious about those privateers we talked about earlier. Who exactly were they?
Oh, there was something else. Private ships, basically given permission by Congress to attack British ships. Legalized pirates.
Legalized pirates. That's amazing.
They caused a lot of trouble for Britain. Captured tons of ships, messed up supply lines, stole valuable cargo, even attacked warships. They were a real pain for the Royal Navy.
Wow. So they weren't just random pirates looking for treasure. They actually helped the war effort.
Oh yeah, big time. They were a key part of things. Resourceful and clever, just like the rest of the American war effort. But even though Britain had the advantage at first, things weren't all smooth sailing for them either.
Right. We talked about how hard it was to supply an army across the ocean. Did that get worse as the war dragged on?
For sure. Keeping the troops supplied with everything they needed. A constant headache for the British. And the longer it went on, the more people back in Britain started to wonder, what are we doing? This is costing too much.
So Britain's got a determined enemy, a vast and unforgiving landscape, logistical nightmares, And indeed, people back home are getting fed up. It sounds like the odds were stacking up against them.
You could say that, but the British didn't give up easily. In fact, they changed their strategy and shifted their focus to the south.
Oh, right. The Southern strategy. They thought they'd find more loyalists down there, right? Plus, there was all that tobacco.
Yeah, that was the thinking. Isolate New England, control those valuable resources, except
It didn't work, did it?
not so much. They overestimated the Loyalist support and underestimated the Southern patriots. The campaign became a real slog. Fierce resistance, guerrilla tactics, the whole 9 yards.
So the South, which was supposed to be their salvation, turned into another quagmire.
Yep, pretty much.
Mm.
And this whole shift to the South led them right to a decisive confrontation that would seal their fate.
Oh, man, what happened?
The Battle of Yorktown, Virginia, 1781. A brilliant move by the Americans and their French buddies.
Yorktown. I know the name, but tell me what happened.
Okay, so the British, led by General Cornwallis, were trapped on a peninsula, Yorktown. It juts right into Chesapeake Bay.
Trapped? How'd that happen?
Washington, with the French, they marched south and surrounded Yorktown. And at the same time, the French fleet blocked the bay. Cornwallis had nowhere to go.
They were completely boxed in.
Exactly. A siege, weeks of it. No supplies, no escape. Cornwallis had to surrender his entire army.
Wow. The British must have been crushed.
You bet. It basically ended the major fighting. Peace talks took another 2 years, but the war was over.
What an incredible moment. It's mind-blowing how one battle, with brilliant planning, French help, and just pure grit, could bring down an empire.
It really is a pivotal moment in history. It shows the courage, resilience, and strategy of the Americans.
This is already so fascinating. We've barely scratched the surface. But before we move on, we have to talk about the human cost. All those battles, the hardship, it must have been awful.
You're right. War is brutal, and the revolution was no exception. Thousands died on both sides in battle, from disease, starvation, and the civilians caught in the middle. It was a terrible price to pay.
It's true. Freedom is precious, but it doesn't come free.
And the effects went beyond the soldiers. Native American tribes, a lot of them sided with Britain to protect their land, but after the war, broken treaties forced off their land, more conflict.
It's a sad reminder that even a revolution for liberty can hurt those who are already struggling.
Exactly. We need to remember both the good and the bad of the revolution.
I'm so glad we're doing this deep dive. I can't wait to hear more about how the Continental Army faced all these challenges and those surprising ways they overcame them.
Oh, there are some great stories to tell. We'll talk about how they adapted their tactics, those alliances they formed, and how ordinary people helped them achieve the impossible. And we'll see how the war's impact went far beyond the battlefield. It shaped a nation and changed the course of history.
It's going to be good. Listeners, be sure to catch part 2, where we go even deeper into the American Revolution and find out the secrets of their unlikely victory. Welcome back to our deep dive into the American Revolution. I'm telling you, this is way more interesting than I thought it would be.
Yeah, it's amazing how much there is to learn, even about something you think you know.
Exactly. In part 1, we set the scene. Global powers, a nation divided, and a bunch of rebels taking on the mighty British Empire. But now I want to know how the Continental Army, those underdogs, actually managed to win. I mean, they were outmatched in just about every way, right?
Well, one of their secrets was adapting and innovating, fighting a different kind of war. You see, the British, they were all about traditional warfare.
Right, the big organized battles like they fought in Europe.
Yep, lines of soldiers, fancy formations. They were the superpower, used to winning that way. But the Americans, they had to be smarter.
So, not about brute force, but about using their brains. Any examples of this smarter fighting, like battles where they outsmarted the British?
Oh, definitely. The Battle of Trenton, December 1776. Think freezing cold, desperate times for the Continental Army. They needed a win.
December 1776. That was right before Washington crossed the Delaware, right? The one in all those paintings.
That's it. Washington knew he had to do something drastic, so he decided to surprise the Hessians.
The Hessians. Wait, who were they again?
German soldiers, hired by the British. Anyway, they were stationed in Trenton, New Jersey, and they were celebrating Christmas, totally unprepared for what was coming.
So Washington used the element of surprise and good timing.
Exactly. Crossing the Delaware in those conditions was tough enough, but the real stroke of genius was the timing. The Hessians were partying. They never saw it coming.
Brilliant, like a military heist. Did it work?
Oh, yeah. The Americans captured almost 1,000 Hessians, plus all their weapons and supplies. A much-needed victory, boosted morale, and showed everyone the Continental Army could win.
I bet they were thrilled. One well-planned attack and the whole momentum shifts. But we've been talking a lot about Washington. Were there other American commanders who really made a difference?
Definitely. Nathaniel Greene, for example, a brilliant strategist nicknamed the Fighting Quaker. He took over the Southern Army in 1780. They were in bad shape after a bunch of losses.
Oh, right, the Southern Army. That was after Britain shifted their focus down south, right?
Yeah.
What did Greene do differently?
Well, he knew going head-to-head with Cornwallis was a bad idea. The British were too strong. So he used a strategy of attrition. Avoid big battles, harass the British, disrupt their supplies, wear them down.
So not about winning every battle, but about making it so costly for the British that they'd eventually give up.
You got it. He made Cornwallis chase him all over the place, using up their resources and manpower. And Greene was flexible, mixing traditional tactics with guerrilla warfare, keeping the British guessing.
Like he was playing chess with Cornwallis, always thinking several moves ahead. Did it work?
Surprisingly well. He might have lost some battles, but he inflicted heavy losses on the British. Eventually, Cornwallis had to abandon his southern campaign and retreat to Yorktown.
Right where Washington and the French were waiting for him. So Greene, even in defeat, was setting up the final victory.
Exactly. And there's a great example of this in the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, North Carolina, 1781. Greene's forces were outnumbered, but they fought hard and caused a lot of British casualties.
So what was so special about this battle? Was it a turning point in the South?
Technically, the British won, but it was what they call a Pyrrhic victory. They lost so many men and resources that they had to retreat. And where did they go? Yorktown.
Hmm.
Right into the trap.
So Guilford Courthouse, even though Greene lost, was a win in the long run. It set up Yorktown.
Exactly. Greene's unconventional approach, that willingness to make the British pay dearly for every inch, it all paid off in the end.
I'm starting to see the pattern. The Americans used their smarts, their knowledge of the land, and their flexibility to outmaneuver the British. But it wasn't just about battles, was it? What about spying and intelligence? Did that play a role?
Espionage was huge. Both sides were using spies and informants to get information, mess with the enemy, and spread rumors.
Sounds like a spy movie. Any really cool methods or daring missions you can tell us about?
Well, we talked about invisible ink, right? Lemon juice and heat to reveal the message. Both sides used that one.
Simple but effective. But what about, like, organized spy rings, undercover missions?
Oh yeah, they had those too. The Culper Ring, for example. They operated right in New York City, which was occupied by the British.
Wow. Right under their noses. How did they do it?
Coded messages, secret drop-off points, even flags and signals. They relayed all sorts of information to Washington. Troop movements, defenses, plans.
Like something out of a history thriller. That's incredible.
It was a real game changer. The information they got gave Washington a huge advantage. But it's important to remember that the revolution wasn't just about battles and spies. It was about people's lives, about the impact on everyday people.
That's true. What was it like for those who lived through it?
Well, it was tough. War disrupts everything. Shortages, inflation, people lost their homes and farms.
It must have been terrifying, especially for those caught in the middle of the fighting.
Absolutely. And if you supported the Patriots, you were always at risk of being called a traitor. Remember, it was a civil war too. Families and communities were divided.
It's hard to imagine living through that kind of turmoil. But women played a crucial role too, right? It wasn't just the men fighting.
Right. Women kept things going while the men were away. Farms, businesses. They also sewed uniforms, made bandages, nursed the wounded. Some even became spies and messengers.
So much for women staying home. They were right in the thick of it.
Absolutely. They were essential to the American victory. But we can't forget about African Americans, both free and enslaved. The revolution had a huge impact on them too.
Right. I remember from part one that slavery was a big issue.
It was. The ideals of liberty and equality, they sparked debates about slavery. Some slave owners started to question it.
So the revolution planted the seeds for the abolition movement, the movement to end slavery altogether.
Exactly. And it gave African Americans a chance to fight for their own freedom. Thousands joined both sides, hoping to gain their liberty through military service.
That must have been such a tough choice. Fighting for the side that promised freedom or against the side that kept them enslaved.
A heartbreaking dilemma. The revolution gave hope for freedom, but it also exposed the hypocrisy of a nation that claimed to value liberty but still allowed slavery.
It's a reminder that revolutions are messy, complicated things. They don't always solve everything.
Very true. And that's something we'll be looking at in part 3 as we explore what happened after the war and the challenges of building a new nation.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We've gone from those first sparks of rebellion all the way to the victory at Yorktown. But that wasn't the end, right? Winning was just the first step.
Exactly. The hard part was just beginning. They had to actually build a country, one that lived up to all those ideals of liberty and self-government.
I bet everyone breathed a sigh of relief when the fighting stopped. But I'm guessing going from a colony to an independent nation wasn't easy.
Oh, it was rough. Think about it. 13 colonies, all different, each with their own history, interests, even money. Getting them to work together under one government, a huge challenge.
So it wasn't just about beating the British, but about creating a whole new system, a new identity, a new sense of being American. Sounds like there were some bumps along the way.
Definitely. One of the first big problems was figuring out how to actually govern this new country. Their first try, the Articles of Confederation, well, it just didn't work.
The Articles of Confederation. Wasn't that the one where the states had more power than the national government?
Yep. And it caused a lot of problems. The national government couldn't tax, couldn't regulate trade, couldn't even raise an army.
So basically, the country was weak and vulnerable.
Exactly. Plus, the economy was a mess, tons of debt from the war, no unified currency, trade was difficult. Not a good situation.
So not exactly the happy, prosperous nation they were hoping for.
Not at first, no. But all these problems, they actually led to something really important. The Constitution.
Oh yeah, the Constitution.
Yeah.
That amazing document that's been shaping American democracy for centuries.
Mhm.
But how did they go from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution? Was it a sudden aha moment or more like a gradual realization?
A bit of both, actually. There were events like Shays' Rebellion in 1786. Farmers in Massachusetts were fed up with the state government and things got violent.
Oh, wow. So people were rebelling against their own government.
Yep, and it showed everyone just how weak the Articles of Confederation were. The country was falling apart. They needed a stronger national government, one that could actually do its job.
So it was a wake-up call. They realized that internal divisions and a bad economy could destroy everything they had fought for.
Exactly. And that's what led to the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Delegates from all the states met in Philadelphia to figure out how to fix things.
And that's where they came up with the Constitution. But I bet it wasn't easy getting everyone to agree.
Oh, there were some serious arguments.
For-
Representation, the balance of power between the states and the national government, and of course, slavery.
It's amazing to think about those brilliant minds, those founding fathers, wrestling with these huge issues. What were some of the things that almost made the whole thing fall apart?
Well, representation was a big one. The larger states wanted more power because they had more people. The smaller states were afraid of being ignored.
Makes sense. How did they solve that?
The Great Compromise. That's how we got our two houses of Congress. The House of Representatives, based on population, and the Senate, where every state gets two senators no matter how big or small.
Ah, so everyone got something. A brilliant solution. But what about slavery? That was such a divisive issue. How could they even talk about it?
It was tough. It almost broke the convention. In the end, they made some compromises. One was the 3/5 compromise, where enslaved people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation and taxes.
Wow, that's complicated. It shows how deeply slavery was rooted in America, even as they were fighting for freedom.
It does. Sometimes even good things come with difficult compromises. But in the end, the Constitution brought more stability. It created a stronger, more unified nation.
It did. And think about it. That document, written over 200 years ago, is still the foundation for American democracy. But what was it like for ordinary people during those early years? Were they excited about this new country or more worried about what might happen?
Probably a mix of both. I'm sure there was a lot of pride in what they achieved. They'd won their freedom, created a new government. But there were also a lot of unknowns. The economy was shaky. There were still divisions. It was a time of big changes. And change can be scary.
So a time of hope and uncertainty. A brand new nation figuring out how to stand on its own 2 feet. But as we wrap up our deep dive, I think we need to talk about the bigger picture. How did the American Revolution affect not just America, but the rest of the world?
The American Revolution was a game changer, not just here, but globally. It was this incredible experiment in self-government, and when it succeeded, it gave hope to people fighting for freedom everywhere. Think about the Declaration of Independence. Those words about all men being created equal with certain rights, they became a powerful symbol.
So it wasn't just about getting rid of British rule. It was about igniting a global movement for liberty and self-determination.
Exactly, and its impact is still felt today. Those core ideas of democracy, individual rights, limits on government power, They influenced so many other countries.
It's amazing. A bunch of colonies fighting for their freedom ended up changing the world. But as we finish up, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember about the American Revolution?
It wasn't a sure thing. It was a long shot, a David versus Goliath story. These ordinary people risked everything for a chance at freedom, and they won.
So inspiring. It shows that anything is possible if you believe in something strongly enough and are willing to fight for it.
Absolutely. And those lessons from the revolution, they're important today. Freedom is fragile, it has to be protected. Ordinary people can do amazing things when they work together. And the fight for liberty and justice, well, that never really ends.
What a great way to end our deep dive. Thank you so much for taking us on this journey through the American Revolution. It's been fascinating. And to our listeners, we hope this has made you curious to learn more about this amazing period in history. Remember, the past is full of incredible stories, and those stories can teach us so much about ourselves and the world we live in. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep. Tell us what you think about this episode. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.